Well, let's welcome our guest today, Dean Ken Schwartz from Tulane School of Architecture. Ken Schwartz came to Tulane from the University of Virginia, where he was a professor of architecture. He was the former department chair, as well as associate dean and chair of the faculty senate. He has over, 27 years of teaching and practice experience in architecture, preservation, urban design, and community planning. As a founding principal of CPD, Community Planning and Design, he has won 4 national design competitions exploring the constructive force that progressive urbanism and architecture can play in rebuilding cities. In addition to his design work, Mr. Schwartz has served as a planning commissioner and a member of the Board of Architectural Review for the city of Charlottesville, focusing on design and preservation issues in the community. Mr. Schwartz served on the University of Virginia Master Planning Committee and the Art and Architecture Review Board for the Commonwealth of Virginia. He's a past president of the National Architecture Accrediting Board and a recent board member of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. Schwartz was awarded UVA's Alumni Association Distinguished Professor Award, the university's highest teaching honor given to one faculty member each year. Mr. Schwartz is pleased to be continuing his work as an educator, architect, and engaged citizen at the Tulane School of Architecture. So my first question today, well, first, thank you for coming and welcome once again to the UNO campus.
Good to be here.
Does it feel far when you drive all the way from Tulane?
Not
uptown,
at all,
way
just next door.
next door. You've been in New Orleans now for how long?
5 years.
So that's a interesting time, interesting length of a time to be in a city. So if you had to give an assessment of the city now, 5 years in, what's your assessment of being here, and what do you think about New Orleans and where we're heading?
I've seen a lot of change in 5 years, and I was not here when Hurricane Katrina hit, of course. I came almost exactly 3 years after that, and I have to admit that the city felt vulnerable still 5 years ago. I was nervous as a newcomer to the community, and buying a house, getting settled, getting familiar with a brand new place that's, as an outsider, to me anyway, it almost felt like I was a foreigner, like I was moving to another country. A very friendly country with great music and great food, but another place entirely from what I was familiar with. But I must say that over the last 5 years, the city has really progressed in amazing ways. And I always try to think about when it started to feel like things were really catching in a very positive sense, and in different ways at different time frames. But roughly speaking, maybe 3 years ago or so, or 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, depending on what you're looking at, there really started to seem like there was a lot of issues aligning. There's some practical issues that were playing out. I think with the arrival of the Obama administration, I think we saw a lot of the federal appropriations that were in the pipeline to come through New Orleans really start to take hold. So with the libraries, with the schools, separately with the health sciences developments downtown, a huge amount of investment in this community started to really take hold. And it started before 3 years ago, but you could really see it gaining momentum right about 3 years ago or thereabouts. 4 years ago maybe, I don't know. And at this point, if you start looking around different neighborhoods throughout New Orleans, you can see that there are some extraordinary developments that have happened in a relatively short period of time. We've been working in Holly Grove, for example, and Holly Grove, although there's still an enormous amount of work to be done in that neighborhood, it's in a much better place now than it was 5 years ago. We've had a small part to play in it, but a lot of other folks have as well. Or Ferret Street near Tulane. The stretch of Ferret Street between Jefferson and Napoleon is a dramatically different place now than it was 5 years ago. Similar transformations took place in New Orleans over its whole history. If you look at Magazine Street over its history, or the Warehouse District, a lot of neighborhoods have gone through changes, and a lot of factors feed into healthy change over time. But I also think that private investment has been taking hold in recent years in significant ways through startup entrepreneurial ventures, through people who are investing in this community from the private sector, not only from the federal and state support that's come to this city since Hurricane Katrina. So I'm very optimistic about the city's future, and I see us in in a very key place right now as a community, and with great progress continuing, at least for the foreseeable future.
Why did you not become a doctor? Why did you become an architect?
Well, I don't know how much Irvin knows about my background, but actually both of my parents were doctors. My mother was an OBGYN, which is unusual for a woman. If she were still alive, would be 85 years old. But I was always interested in art. I was interested in the built and natural environment. I used to draw like crazy when I was a child. And my father was a surgeon, and I once watched my father operate, in full scrubs, and as you have to be when someone gets operated on, and I fainted when I saw the blood, so that was a pretty easy decision that I wasn't going to be a doctor. But I love the built environment. I love the creativity and the rigor associated with creating buildings and creating landscapes and creating healthy communities. And that's what I've been doing since about the age of 13.
What type of individual do you think should become an architect?
Well, I think about this mostly through the lens of my own students, not just my own experience, but the most successful architecture students I see are the ones who are inquisitive, genuinely curious about the creative process. And they're not necessarily linear thinkers. They're thinkers who are creating or learning by doing and learning through what I would call an iterative process. And I'm sure this is parallel to many in the musical field, that it's not the kind of discipline that you learn by reading a book, although there's a lot of theory and there's a lot of history tied to architecture as there is in music. But really, I think that it's a successful architecture student and a successful architect is someone who is exploring ideas through the expression of built form. And that has to connect with human use, it has to connect with technical issues, financial issues, and a whole wealth of agendas that come together in the context of design. So I think that our most successful students are ones who are really comfortable with uncertainty and take the problem of a challenge as an opportunity, as a creative opportunity. And you can imagine that's a wonderful area in which to teach, because if you can connect up with students to help them understand how to move their ideas forward, starting sometimes with absolutely no idea of where to begin, and then slowly but surely kind of zeroing in on a possibility, I think that's really a magical experience. When I was teaching more, before I was dean, I was a regular faculty member teaching and practicing. I used to like to teach at the earliest level of the design curriculum, because at those moments you're really setting in motion the direction that a young person has in the design process. A lot of faculty members prefer to teach at the advanced level. And I was saying earlier to your students that I brought along this book of student work, and it does a great job of showing the curriculum in reverse chronological order. It starts with the final year of our program, and then it works backwards to the first year. But if you start at the first year, you can see that the students are exploring fundamentals of design. And I think it's an exciting moment when students begin to sort of see the possibilities within very, very initial steps they take as designers.
What kind of living can you make in the field of architecture? Give me the entire scale.
Well, typically speaking, the starting salaries in my field are rather low. If you compare a starting salary for an architect with a lawyer, let's say,
Okay.
or a doctor, it would be lower. There's no question about it. Parenthetically, I have a daughter who's right now in law school, and she'll probably do quite well when she finishes law school. But her very first job was very modest in terms of the salary she started at in working for the district attorney in Manhattan as a paralegal. But she was really interested in getting experience in the criminal justice system in a very fine office in New York City. It's Law and Order, the TV show. That's the place, a real place. But architects start out typically at a relatively modest starting salary, but I think there's a tremendous potential to do well financially in my field. And architects have a tendency to plead poverty all the time. Even the ones who are doing very, very well plead poverty. I don't quite know why we do this to ourselves. I see a field that has tremendous abundance and opportunity, and I know my classmates who are practicing architecture traditionally, virtually every single one of them is a principal of a major firm, and they are comparable to a law partner or an advertising executive partner or anybody in a service industry at a very high level of compensation, and I'm talking about very high levels of compensation. So the way that architects who are successful financially achieve that success is either through building their practices, which is a tried and true method in law and in other professional services fields. But also we have a lot of architects who do other allied businesses, real estate development, in industry. And it's really, and in New Orleans, we have some excellent examples of architects who have done very well, and they've helped us to build a healthy community by, in many instances, recycling older buildings and figuring out how to make those profitable ventures through tax credits and so on. And so I think that the training that an architect gets allows him or her to be very successful in an array of disciplines, both traditionally practicing architecture, as well as tying into other disciplines that are related to architecture in some form or another.
If you are a philosophy major, what should your interest in architecture be about?
Well, if you're a philosophy major, first of all, you're probably asking fundamental questions about the meaning of life, right? And I think that, culture and quality of life issues play out in a number of different ways through the arts. So I would say that architecture matters from the standpoint of its place as one of the fine arts. It also matters because the quality of the environment that we create as a city, as a community, is fundamental to how we sort of see ourselves in a larger sort of civic relationship or set of relationships. But architecture's I think both the good news and the bad news about architecture, the good news is it's all around us and it's fundamental and we can't escape it. It's really, it's part of our subconscious always. The bad news is that in my field, a lot of times everyone thinks they're an expert. And it's rare to find someone who thinks that all of a sudden their opinions about surgery tell them that they can perform a complicated operation. It's not at all rare to find someone who says, well, they know a lot about buildings, so they're going to tell you how to do your building. And it's really, for architects, we have a very public, a very social art. And so we have a different place in society than other professionals, like attorneys who seldom get questioned by their clients, or surgeons who are usually left to do their work, and people don't try to second guess their surgical decisions.
You're familiar with the medical district?
Somewhat. I'm not familiar with it in detail, but I am familiar with it.
What about the process of, what do you think is the appropriate process to get people involved with, especially with major public spaces that are being planned, or in New Orleans we've gone in the last, as you've seen, in the last 5 years, what you're talking about is all the planning, and as it starts to really come through, as the ideas turn into tangible things, things start to change. Streets are changing. As a matter of fact, you just driving around town right now, it seems like every street you can drive on is under construction.
Right.
At this point in time. What do you think about the public process of being involved in the design of your city or your neighborhood or different areas?
Well, I think the medical district is a very good example to play that question out. It was really gaining steam right when I arrived, and I remember reading a lot about it when I first came here in August of 2008. And it was very much a top-down decision about getting, replacing the lost charity, getting the whole medical operation up and running again. It's a very important part of the community, both for health reasons, but also for economic reasons as well. And I also remember that there was a lot of protest, a lot of anxiety about the number of blocks that were being taken by eminent domain to make that possible, the historic houses that were being moved. These, in many cases, were people who were just rebuilding post-Katrina. And it was a big controversy 5 years ago, and I followed it. I was in no way involved, but I was interested. And I was restrained from taking any kind of position or having any real opinion, in part because Tulane, as a university, was part of that debate, that discussion. We have a great medical school, and I think there was some question about how this whole development was going to impact our medical school. And so I watched it with a lot of interest. I also remember that Mayor Landrieu came in, when his administration came in, I think one of the first things he did was commission a study to try to figure out how that master plan for that medical district could become more pedestrian-friendly, more urban, and less suburban as a strategy. I think part of the problem with the medical district in its first introduction, its first proposal, was that there was a whole lot of parking and a whole lot of buildings set back from streets. And as we all know in New Orleans, you got to have buildings related to streets, otherwise you don't have streets, or you don't have healthy streets. So I think the project, the scheme improved based on that work and based on a lot of citizen agitation about making a better place. If we're going to do this thing, we better try to do it right if we can. So, and I think the outcome of that was really a good example of how a mayor and the citizens who were so vocal about trying to make it better actually did improve in the process. There's still in the background the question of what happens with Charity Hospital, which was one of the big debates 5 years ago, and it's still a debate. It's still a question. What happens with this important building, but it may be more important than the building itself, the important legacy of what that building represented to this whole region. And I think there are discussions about how to repurpose that building and make it part of the civic infrastructure of the city again.
Earlier, you were talking about the city center.
Yes.
And I don't know if you had an opportunity to kind of discuss that your students actually get to participate and take projects from the idea phase all the way to the finish. Is that something that's very usual in different architecture schools where students actually physically get to build the spaces that they plan? Or is that something unique to Tulane?
Well, I don't think any school in the United States is doing it to the extent that we are. But I would say that there are about 125 schools of architecture in the United States, and most of them have something going on. And this is really a legacy of the last 20 years, that there was an important study by the Carnegie Foundation on education, and it was called the Boyer Report, but it was essentially, its real title was Building Community. And it was looking critically at architectural education in relation to real social needs, real issues of communities. Mm-hmm. And the author of that study, it was a 2-year-long study, Dr. Ernest Boyer, a very famous educator and thinker about education, not just about architecture, basically made the argument that in order for architecture schools to really be relevant as we approached the turn of the century at that time, it was 1994 or 95, we needed to become more engaged. We needed to become embedded and involved with our communities. Now that sounds obvious given architecture is such a social art, but it was not happening at very many institutions to a great degree. It was really very rare in the 80s, for example. Well, I think what he did was he prophesized the future, and I think a lot of his advocacy really led schools to realize that this could be important in the education of young women and men in my field. And what's happened since that time is it's really taken off. It's become much more common to see schools that are engaged. Now, my prior institution, the University of Virginia, had a pretty long tradition of that in certain ways. We were doing versions of this, but part of the reason that I got so interested in Tulane University and in New Orleans is that in the winter of 2008, President Cowan visited me in Charlottesville and talked about his vision for Tulane University and its relationship to the city. I had never met this gentleman before. I'd read about what had happened with Hurricane Katrina. I had read about really almost the revolution that was taking place at Tulane University, but I'd never really thought about it in a personal way. And I thought this is just an extraordinary experiment, and an experiment that is vitally important because of the importance of the institutions of higher education broadly in the city, all 7 of the institutions, not just Tulane. And so I thought this is something to become a part of and to see how I could contribute to this process that was well underway in 2008 and that I've played a part in the last 5 years. But I think a student's opportunity to work on real projects is extremely compelling to the students. They want to be able to connect up their education with real-world challenges and to see how that becomes a learning process, but also a creative spark for what they're trying to do with their lives.
What does that look like?
Varies a lot. I mean, we have a lot of different kinds of projects. One of the professors at the school, Judith Kennard, is working in Holly Grove on a project that's called the Green Line, and she's working with the Sewage and Water Board on, it's an abandoned rail line that goes from our Holly Grove Farmers Market all the way to the 17th Street Canal. It's about 3/4 of a mile. It's a kind of a gentle arc. It used to be a rail line. And what they're doing is they're taking this sort of abandoned landscape and trying to, and it's right now it has a chain link fence on either side. It has a buried canal underneath it, and basically you can't build on top of it because it's got this important drainage canal underneath it.
Oh, okay.
They're trying to repurpose it and make it a part of the landscape and part of the community that can be used. Playgrounds, sort of lightweight gardens that go along, that a lot of different uses along that 3/4 mile. So that's a planning project with little installations and sort of tests that they do along the way. They're trying to educate the neighborhood on how water can be managed and slowed down and not necessarily just piped out. So that's a planning project and a landscape project. Other projects are design build. The example of the Magellan Gardens, little garden on a sort of infill shotgun site that was abandoned. That project is a project that was conceived by students and built in one semester. And if you go out there in Algiers, it's amazing. It's a beautiful little intervention in a neighborhood that's become a kind of catalyst for that that area of Algiers. Same is true with the Guardians of the Flame, but that one took 2 years. That was a very ambitious project. It was led by Scott Ruff, who's one of the faculty members in my school. And it really took quite a while to get through all the approvals, to get it built. Several different generations of students, if you will, participated in that. And so they plugged in at various phases over the course of that construction. It's up and running.
What happens, I would have to imagine this happens, not that I've heard anything about it, but I'd have to imagine that sometimes it doesn't get done on time, it doesn't
Yes.
work out the way you thought it was going to work out, the plans have to not match up to what the outcome is. What happens in those scenarios? Well, one, does that happen?
Yes,
or-
that's correct. I think that actually happens in private practice, too.
Yeah, that's what-
That's the
obviously.
reality of architecture. But sometimes projects are very successful planning projects, but for whatever reasons, they don't come to fruition. They don't happen. And really, there's a terrific project that I wish would come to fruition, but it hasn't yet. This is the year before I came here. The School of Architecture, in collaboration with LSU and their landscape program, did a project called the Viet Village. It was a project for Father, he was on the NORA board with you, Father, I forget his last name. He was the priest for the Vietnamese community in New Orleans
Vin,
East.
Father Vin.
Yeah, he was the client. He was sort of like the mayor of that part of the community. And we were asked to come in and help imagine a recovery for that area of the community that was devastated by Katrina. And the idea for that recovery was very, very low-density houses with urban agriculture sort of built into each house. And very much like the Vietnamese would have lived in the similar topography in South Vietnam before they immigrated to the United States. So we did a beautiful plan, and it won a National Design Award from the Association of Landscape Architects. We won a National Design Award from our students' work in this neighborhood. And for whatever the reasons, they couldn't find the funding to really make that happen. It would have taken several millions of dollars to make it happen. The students learned a lot, the neighborhood was very involved, and it was a very viable vision for the future of that neighborhood. But that's an example where it's sort of a failure in one sense, that it didn't come to fruition, but it was successful in the sense of really trying to imagine something that's possible in a very challenging topography. It's low, it floods, and you got to plan for that flooding in a way that doesn't say to these folks that they just have to leave. They can occupy that land, but they have to plan for the fact that it will flood not just in a hurricane, but in a very heavy rain under normal circumstances. In architectural terms, we, as our program, have to deal with the same thing that a typical practice has to deal with, which is building codes and approvals. And actually, that's one of the main reasons that the Guardians of the Flame project took a while to get done, because it wasn't so easy to get the permits and the approvals, not actually casting any blame on the building department. We had to satisfy them appropriately for all the legitimate reasons of life safety. In the end, Scott Ruff and the Tulane City Center got it done, and it's a very successful project. It took probably twice as long as they expected it would. But it's a great project, and it was definitely worth all the sweat that went into it.
What would you say is the most controversial I would say, most controversial architectural scenario you've experienced in your lifetime? Either as just a bystander, as someone participating in a project, or even as a professor.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about one that's very personal that I was involved with directly. I had, my private practice, in addition to my role as a professor at the University of Virginia. Community Planning and Design was a firm that I led and worked on a project with Maurice Cox in the city of Richmond, Virginia. For those who don't know, Richmond, it's the state capital. It's, like many cities, it's a city that had a very important historic and influential black community. It went through a heyday of music and of literature and of business that was extremely important, especially in the 1920s and into the 30s. And it's called Jackson Ward. It's a political block, but it's also an important neighborhood in that city. It was bisected by the interstate highway system. I-95 went right through Jackson Ward in the heyday of the interstate highway agenda, which virtually every city in the United States experienced. Well, the former governor of Virginia, Doug Wilder, became mayor of the city of Richmond, and he hired a very good planning director. She hired me to take on North Jackson Ward, which was literally severed from the historic core of Jackson Ward, the sort of center of that community. That had become the largest public housing site between D.C. and Atlanta, 942 units of public housing. Extraordinarily high incidence of crime, poverty, and totally dysfunctional community, and there was no way out. And Mayor Wilder wanted to figure out how we could imagine a better future for this neighborhood. So we were hired as the community designers, Maurice and I were. And we had a whole public process set in place to involve the community in this process. But at the end of the day, what Mayor Wilder had in mind and what my economic analysts had, the people I brought onto my team for feasibility studies, was a future that's not an unfamiliar future for other redevelopment projects in public housing sites across this country. And it is a model that can work, which is basically rebuild that community with a mix of incomes. Not just people with, an average family income of $5,000 a year, which is roughly what it was then, 6,000, something in that range, but get a mixed income, a mix of public housing, workforce housing, and market rate housing, roughly a third each. So instead of having 942 units of public housing, it would be roughly 300 or so at each of those income levels, and designed in a way where the income levels are mixed and not segregated and not actually perceivable which one is a public housing unit and which one's a market rate unit. It happens to be less than a half mile from Virginia Commonwealth University's Medical College of Virginia, which is a huge place to find market-driven housing. People want to live within walking distance. It's a great neighborhood if you could only deal with the crime and the poverty. Mm-hmm. And we did this project. It was extremely controversial, and Mayor Wilder was in the hot seat because of this project. It didn't get done. And it didn't get done in large part because we told the mayor that it would take $100+ million of subsidy to deal with the urban infrastructure, the physical construct that would have to subsidize this project to make it happen through, at that point, through market forces once you did that subsidy. So it's tough when you're in the middle. And, the public housing folks, many of them were very, very concerned about how they would live when they were displaced from that housing. And the answer is, we will take care of you through Section 8 vouchers, but that's not a very convincing response. So anyway, that was one of the projects that I worked on very closely, and you really, it's humbling when you realize how large these issues are, how design itself is not the only thing that can solve these problems. In fact, it can't solve the problems all by itself, that it takes a whole mix of ingredients, economics, politics, design, people, to make something happen. In that instance, the stars didn't align. And the mayor didn't do, as far as I know, the mayor didn't do anything.
Well, we have two similar scenarios that you mentioned with obviously Claiborne Avenue that killed the business district for minority business, back when they brought the highway system through.
Right.
And as well as the public housing issue, which you've obviously caught the tail end of.
Right.
Right now, we're experiencing now, I believe Iberville is the last
Right.
public housing developments I think that they're bringing down, and I think that they've started on those, am I right? So we're kind of in the middle, so I guess we have yet to see if it's going to work or not, but we know what was happening before it wasn't working.
Yeah, and the Claiborne corridor is one of the corridors that we have started to get involved in some modest ways. And part of what Maurice Cox is looking at is, what are the different scenarios working with the community, with or without that highway in place? It's possible that the highway will come down someday. It's not at all certain that that's going to happen. And you have to also think about the very good likelihood that it's not going to come down, and how can you still figure out ways to reconnect the community in ways that have been really fundamentally altered by the imposition of that highway back in the 60s.
I always find it interesting how years later, someone will look at something that was done 40 years ago and say, that actually was a tremendously expensive, bad idea. And we should go back to and spend now whatever the market rate is, which is probably 30 times whatever it costs to build it before, to actually put it back.
Well, that's what Boston did, and it was billions of dollars. That's what San Francisco did, and they had an earthquake that essentially took care of the demolition for them with some loss of life, but also all of a sudden Embarcadero has become a street again and is part of the life of the riverfront, the bayfront. So there are cities actually all over the country that are looking at issues like this and rethinking what was really orthodoxy in the 50s and 60s. And people now pretty much acknowledge that whether it was an elevated highway like Claiborne, or in the case of North Jackson Ward, that was actually a depressed highway. It sort of sliced through the city below grade, but still it did the same thing. It chopped off what was formerly a very beautiful residential neighborhood, African-American neighborhood in the city, that was no longer connected to its commercial core. Very familiar problem. So no, I think unfortunately we make a lot of mistakes, and then we have to spend a lot of money and also a lot of human capital and sometimes more than one generation to solve those mistakes. But cities are reinventing themselves now, and I think what we're going to see over the next 25 years is that cities across the country are investing in themselves. They're recreating themselves from inside. And I think people are more and more recognizing that living in a city has some significant advantages. So if you think about someone as they're aging, if you can live in a city and you can get around either by transit or on foot, it's a very different quality of life than if you have to drive everywhere you go just to get a gallon of milk or to do something very routine in your life, to see the doctor. So I think that that's changing. I started a graduate program 3 years ago in my school in sustainable real estate development. And the whole idea of that graduate program is, how do you regenerate cities? We're not interested in greenfield development. We're not doing greenfield development. We're trying to teach young women and men at the graduate level, how do you use the tools available to you, financial, political, design, you name it, to reinvent cities from within. And of course, New Orleans is a great laboratory for this. It's happening. I mean, Rouse's downtown is a huge step for our the warehouse CBD district. Having that grocery store where it is and as part of that neighborhood is extremely powerful. And that's to see that happen is just fantastic. I think there's something like 3,000 plus housing units in that area, and lots of people who can now walk to their grocery store, a very good grocery store in walking distance.
You've done our word association before,
I have.
so I don't have to tell you about it.
Not for a couple of years, though.
But you're ready to roll with it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What is your favorite word?
Beauty.
What is your least favorite word?
Hatred.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
My daughters.
What turns you off?
Discrimination.
I thought you were going to say their boyfriends.
Well, they're not nearly as bad.
What is your favorite curse word?
It starts with a S and ends with a T.
What sound or noise do you love?
I love the sound of laughter.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Fingernails on blackboards, but we don't see that many blackboards anymore.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Wow. Politics.
What profession would you like not to do?
Surgery.
If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You were a good husband and a good parent.
All right, let's open it up for questions for Dr. Schwartz. Who's first today?
Yes.
I did a research paper on the charity hospital thing about how they tore down this 23 blocks in Mid-City to build that new hospital.
You probably know more
That
than
was
I do now.
3 years ago.
Yeah.
And like now they're building that big hospital, spending millions of dollars. And I read about how they could, revitalize the charity hospital, which is already there in New Orleans. And it's like an important building in the history of New Orleans. So you think it was a mistake to build that new hospital?
Well, I do remember the debate 5 years ago very well, and there were very strong opinions on both sides. There was a study commissioned that the preservation community commissioned a study that looked at repurposing Charity Hospital again as a hospital and looked at the feasibility, the costs, and so on. They advocated for that, and they argued that it would be less expensive, that it was certainly viable to do it, et cetera. The state that was pushing the medical center as it's currently being built out argued exactly the opposite position, and they had plenty of experts who were arguing on that side of the debate. I never knew enough about either side to have an opinion, to be honest with you. I've always known that it's an important building historically, as a building, in the history of architecture, but also as an institution socially for this community. So having watched the decision play out and having watched the new medical center coming out of the ground, it's always still been my hope that roughly 1 million square feet of space would be used, and preferably used in a civic capacity. So not just as, let's say, spec office building, but in a way that had some real significance to the city of New Orleans, as Charity Hospital did from the day it was built. So do I think it was a mistake? I don't know enough one way or the other to know if it was the right move or not. It is what it is now, and we need to start figuring out what happens next, both in terms of the quality of the environment of the medical district itself, the new district, as well as what happens in that whole area of downtown New Orleans as it evolves in the next decade, let's say. I think it will evolve. I don't know how. I don't know what will be there or how it will work. But I suspect that there are a number of different entities throughout the city that are thinking about that issue right now.
What class did you write the paper for?
It was an English class, but they compared it to, in the 60s when they put the interstate through the Treme and how, they kind of alienated that neighborhood from business and stuff like that. And they just kicked out, everyone in 23 blocks of land in downtown Mid-City. That must have been difficult.
So what are your thoughts about it? Do you think that was the right thing to do? Or?
I just read that a bunch of people, since the storm, they were building all these new houses in that area, and really nice old New Orleans houses from, 1600s or whatever. And I don't think they gave them enough money for their new living situations after, I guess it's eminent domain. They were able to demolish all those houses. So
They moved a bunch of them, but you're right. That's what I thought too at the time. I thought about the people who moved back into, in many instances, moved back into their homes or small businesses after the storm, and they were rebuilding their lives. And before it was clear that this was going to be happening, and they definitely were caught in the larger process that took place. And eminent domain, if you look at the history of planning in the United States, eminent domain is a right. It's called a police power. It's It is one of the powers that a community has to exercise legitimately for many good reasons. We all need to have water, and we all need to deal with sewage, so, for example, and you've got to be able to put those facilities somewhere. You've got to have public facilities of various kinds, including hospitals. So eminent domain is an important tool. It's not an evil tool automatically, but how it's exercised is very controversial in communities all across the country. And the positives that come across through eminent domain can usually be identified, but also the impacts and the process by which it's exercised is almost always fraught with difficulty. Now, the idea is that they're compensated at fair market value, but that's easier said than done, and it's almost always a problem for those who are caught in the crossfire. Most communities exercise it very, very sparingly because of this, and I'm sure that this is true in New Orleans as well. I don't think that this step was taken lightly, and there's all sorts of legitimate criticism and debate about it, but in the end, it's there. Now we've got to move on and figure out what happens next.
I've just never seen eminent domain exercised in rich people's neighborhoods.
It's very rare. That's actually one of the big controversies. I mean, that highway in Richmond that I was talking about could have just as easily gone someplace else, but of course it didn't. It went through the neighborhood that had the least political power and the least economic throw weight. And unfortunately, that is the history of eminent domain in the United States too. I think that's changing. It has changed actually from the 1960s and 70s somewhat, but it's still an issue.
Next question.
Yes?
You were talking about when you were talking about your students' creative process and watching them take it from idea to building. You said something about what you called the iterative
Yes.
process. Could you describe that?
Well, maybe it's a $3 word, but it's what I mean by it is that you learn by repetitive action. So, there's a lot of students who are really successful high school students, my daughters included, are very much accustomed to getting assignment, doing the project, doing really well, and moving on. That's like a one-off task. And actually, if you look at creative people in music, in literature, in any kind of art form, in architecture, most of us are quite comfortable with the idea that you almost never get it right the first time, and that you learn by trying things out. And this applies, I'm not a musician, I admire great musicians, but I see it in music, and I see it in my own work, that the way I work when I'm working on a design problem is I almost always start with the first idea. You got to start somewhere. It's almost always a dumb idea, and I'm always suspect of my first iteration, and then I try a few more. And if you come up to my design studios at our school, you'll see yellow tracing paper and little models and junk all over the place, and this is the creative process of our students trying things out many times. And we've got some professors who are really good at getting the students to iterate, reiterate over and over again. The students, of course, get a little bit crazy about this over time because at a certain point, they just want to move on and get something done. And that is also part of learning as a designer and learning as any kind of creative discipline. So, but it's part of the thing I love about my discipline is that there aren't necessarily right answers, absolutely right answers. There are ways that you can compose that actually work well from a functional standpoint. There are ways that you can compose that produce beauty. And although beauty is a subjective thing, you can actually start to understand what creates a harmonious composition in architecture. And that's part of what we teach.
Next question.
Yes?
Okay, so I started out like pretty much how you did. My father was a physician, and I kind of just...
So you know my pain.
Yeah, I went my whole life just like, on that path to become a doctor. And I've recently realized that it wasn't for me. And I've been kind of interested in, community reform. And hopefully in spring I'm going to be working with the Healing Center of downtown.
That's great.
And I wanted to kind of bring to the table like making less of just like a business standpoint and more reaching out to the community, like educating people on the importance of nutrition and getting involved with different organizations.
That's great.
So I guess my question is like, how does the undergrad like me, who's not in your program, kind of like network with those other organizations, get things started up like that student garden you were talking about in City Park?
But it sounds like you're doing it already. I mean, just showing up is a good start, and getting plugged into some nonprofit or some activity that you think is interesting and valid is a great way to start. And you'd be amazed at what you can do just by showing up and starting to be useful in whatever setting that might be. My younger daughter's doing exactly that. She graduated with an arts and sciences degree last May, and she's been sort of bouncing around. This is the violinist, and she's a good musician, very good musician, but she's got a band, but she's actually interning in different situations in Washington, D.C. Her major was in government and Chinese. She's fluent in Mandarin. So what she wants to do is she wants to be able to do something in the international settings, and she's doing this and that. She hasn't really found the right connection. But she just called me yesterday because she's got an interview at an internship it's a research position in an sort of Asian-oriented research enterprise, a nonprofit. So in her case, it's not community-based, but it's tied to something she cares about. And she's exploring and sampling different things, and meanwhile she's doing her gigs at night, and she's having a good time trying to figure out what she's going to do next.
What's your major?
I'm in environmental science. It was biology, but just switched over.
Well, just my advice is follow your instincts, because you're going to be fine. And there's plenty of great opportunities in New Orleans that are very much aligned with your interests, and you'll find something that starts to connect for you. And it's great to hear that you're doing this. This is a great way to get started.
Next question.
Yeah.
So how old were you when you did your first architect project, and what did you do?
I started really when I was about 12 or 13, but I wouldn't say I really did an architecture project. I did a lot of drawing, and I was really interested in art and in landscape, so I just drew a lot, basically, and just I started thinking about the world around me. And then I also started reading a lot. And I remember reading some architectural treatises when I was in high school. I didn't know there was such a thing, but, people have been writing about architecture since 2,000 years ago. And the oldest treatise is by a guy named Vitruvius, and I read it when I was in high school. And it's in English, not in Latin. So I was curious, and I was curious about the world around me. And I think that's not that unusual. There are young people who are curious about music. They see that they have some talent, and they just start following their love, whatever that's starting to be. So I'm a very big, strong supporter of teenagers, high school kids. Just if you've got something that interests you, do it. And then when you get in college, you become more methodical about it. You become more disciplined about it. And whatever it is that you're studying, even if it's not necessarily your major, if you've got a paper you got to write on something, you tackle it, you take it seriously, you try to make as much out of that as you can, and then you move on to the next thing.
Next question.
But let me answer one other thing.
Sure.
I had an unusual opportunity. When I was in architecture school is typically 5 years, undergraduate 5 years, and my parents asked me to design and build a house for them when I was a fourth-year student. And, they had the financial means to do it, and they were crazy enough to ask me to do it for them. So I designed and built my first house when I was a fifth-year student. I designed it when I was a fourth-year student, and then got it built when I was a fifth-year student. And my father still lives there. That was, I don't want to tell you how many years ago that was. It was a long time ago.
Wow.
But it's a rare privilege to be able to do something like that at a really young age, but especially for your parents. I mean, and they were a pain in the neck as clients. And they would definitely say the same thing about me as their architect. But I'm still proud of the house. I would do it very differently if I designed it today. It would be, back in 1979, which is when I got it built, people didn't talk about sustainable design. Although there had been an energy crisis in the 70s, people hadn't really figured out how to build with the same kind of sophistication that we have today in environmental terms. It would be a completely different house if I did it today. And in fact, my father's now 85 years old, and about every other year, I talk to him and say, you need a new house, and let me do a new house for you. This is ridiculous. We can do much better than this house. And he hasn't bought that argument yet.
How long did it take you to build the house?
A year.
Did you manage the building yourself?
I did. I mean, it was unusual because my school was only 100 miles away from where I grew up. And so once a week I would drive. I took one day a week off from school and drove back to Rochester, where I grew up, and had my job meetings on site once a week. And, I was 21 years old. It's not that common that you got a 21-year-old, telling a 45-year-old contractor what to do. But we got it done. So it was amazing. And I think, my parents knew that this was a passion of mine from the time I was a little kid. And they weren't completely crazy because I had worked every summer in an architecture firm. I was pretty serious for a 21-year-old.
That is a once-in-a-lifetime story right there.
Yeah, and the fact that he's still there and still happy there that means a lot to me. And he's not going to leave. He'll leave he'll leave sometime, but not anytime soon, I hope.
Wow. Next question.
He's no longer cutting people, thank God. He's stopped cutting people. He's still teaching, but he's not operating.
What project are you most proud of?
Oh, that's an interesting question. My wife is also my partner. We practiced together for many years. I'm not practicing right now, but she is. But we did a couple projects together that were really, really special, really amazing projects. And one was built for a client in Charlottesville that is absolutely spectacular. I think it's the most beautiful project that we've done. And the client was just a nice couple. The husband was a law professor. They had a lot of money, and the wife was the curator of Monticello. So she was very, very knowledgeable about architecture, art,
Wow.
Thomas Jefferson, and amazing couple because she was really creative, really, she could respond to ideas that we brought forward. And he was very engaged too, but he was like whatever they say, left brain, right brain. He was very, very analytical. So whatever the issues were that we would bring forward, he would analyze them, not just in terms of dollars, but in sort of, what does this mean and how does this work? It was very analytical. She was much more intuitive and much more sort of artistically oriented. They're still good friends of ours, but that house really turned out beautifully, and they're very, very happy with it. It does not look Jeffersonian, because one of the things that she said at the very outset was that, look, I curate Monticello. We're not going to create a Jefferson house. I mean, that would be ridiculous. And so it's a house that actually has a much closer relationship to a kind of vernacular tradition of Virginia farmhouses. So it has a more modest, it's not a modest house, but it has it doesn't look, it's not brick and columns. It's a very more abstract, more modern house than that.
What kind of materials?
It's the exterior is stucco, and there's a tradition of stucco farmhouses in Virginia, which goes back 200 years. Mm-hmm. And then the roof is a copper, turn-coated copper. Copper is standing seam roofs are a very traditional roof in Virginia as well. Wow. So it's not like a farmhouse that you see driving through the countryside. It's a lot more sophisticated than that, but it sort of connects with that sort of feel. Sloped roof, and a really beautiful landscape. So I love that project, and I very much like the couple too. They've become very good friends. And then we did a whole series of national design competitions, most of which did not get built. But we did some very important speculations on how to build responsibly in communities in different ways. We won a big competition in Baltimore for 600 units of housing, and it was reimagining a whole section of Baltimore that was really not in good shape. And it was an important project for us early in our careers, and I'm very proud of that project. But it really was looking at a different way of developing a landscape, an urban landscape that was really distinctive at that time. So that was, I care a lot about it. That was a long time ago too, but it was a good piece of work. And I wish it had gotten done, but sometimes the political processes don't allow really great projects to come to fruition. The mayor changed. We did it under one mayor, and then a new mayor got elected, and he didn't think it was a good project, so we didn't get it built.
Last question?
What was that, I'm sorry. What was that project, started with an R in City Park you were talking about? earlier?
The project in City Park was called GrowDat. The students named it. It's about food. So in the middle of this one, there's a map. It's rather abstract, but you can figure things out if you look. You can find the French Quarter. You can find City Park for sure. It's number 13. So if you want to go exploring in City Park, you can find it very easily. I had a donor who gave me some money, and he likes shipping containers. Did you know this? That's why we have the shipping containers. So you'll see some beautiful green painted shipping containers. Well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Some people like shipping containers, some people don't. But I figured, what the heck? I mean, he gave me a bunch of money, and we wouldn't do this project without his support. So he helped get it started. And ever since then, it's just been, I'm not exaggerating, but there's probably close to $1 million that have come into that project, primarily to support the youth program. Because, it's one thing, we designed and built the campus. If you go out there, you'll see the physical environment. That's what my students and faculty did. But if you look at the landscape, there's a woman named Johanna Gilligan, and she and another guy developed the program, which is this whole youth empowerment program around food. And a lot of the money is coming in to support that program from foundations and so on. It's a brilliant project. And we helped to make it happen, but it happened because of a lot of other people, too. So GrowDat is definitely worth visiting. Go wander around there, talk to some of the, I always say kids, but I'm told I got to keep calling them youth. I'm not supposed to call them kids.
We call them kids.
There's something significant about the word youth as opposed to kids, I guess. Anyway, they're amazing. And actually, Irvin played at a grand opening that we had for it last March. And one of the youth spoke at that event, and he was amazing. He talked about what this whole project has meant to him. And actually, he's got a good rap on, there's an MTV rap that you can hear of his. His name is Ace. And it's really has changed his life. He was one of the youth one year. He was really good, so he was then promoted to become one of the leaders. I don't know what he's doing now. That was last year. And they're in the third year of operation now, and they're really going full steam ahead.
What was your question?
You were saying that the couple that you made the house for, the one guy was analytical and the woman was...
Well, he's a lawyer.
Well, yeah. So how much of each side of your brain would you say you have to use as an architect? Because, I mean, it's an art, but...
Well, truth be told, there are some architects who probably lean more in one direction and some who lean in the other. But I think you have to have both. I think our best students have both. They sort of play one against the other in their own creative process. But I will say that between my wife and myself, one of us is more one way and the other is more the other way. But I'm not going to tell you who's who. I'm too smart to do that.
So let's thank our guest, Dean Schwartz, for coming today. See y'all next week.